There's a weather-related crisis going on right now in Texas. A massive winter storm and lingering sub-freezing temps in places not at all prepared for them has created a power grid failure that has left millions in the Lone Star State without electricity. And it may be days before power is restored. That's prompted anger and questions about how this happened. And is it possible that something like what happened in Texas could happen elsewhere? Joining us this afternoon, Dr. Eric Wachsman. He's director of the Maryland Energy Innovation Institute at the University of Maryland. It's great to have you along. We talked about electricity being out. Natural gas is also being affected as well. The net result is it's cold in many places, below freezing. The lights are out. The power is out. And folks in some places are having to bust up furniture and burn it in the fireplace just to keep warm. It's a mess in Texas, and it sort of begs the question, how did they get there? Is there a short answer, big picture look that we can sort of put to what this Texas situation is?
They don't have the insulation. They don't have the energy efficiency in their buildings like we do in Maryland. The grid infrastructure is problematic, and they rely very heavily on fossil fuels, in particular natural gas. And so if you're using natural gas for heating and for electric power generation, and you actually have to shut off some of the natural gas power plants because the pipes are freezing and things of that nature, it causes a disruption to the grid. Their grid really was just not designed to handle the capacity that was necessary to heat all of the homes and businesses when it got this cold. And so that resulted in the rolling blackouts that they observed.
Doctor, one of the things, too, to talk about is Texas sort of being an interesting case in that they talk about that they haven't deregulated the power distribution effort so much as they have changed how it works. And that's given rise it's kind of a free marketplace. You can buy your power from a lot of different sources, and in some cases pay very little for it. The problem being those smaller vendors are farther up the chain, are losing their electricity and their natural gas. So the net result is the user at home, whatever their source is, just doesn't have the power. Is this a unique case in Texas, or are there other places that are following this model?
So the old saying is, be careful what you ask for, you might get it. Texas is unique in many different ways. It has its own grid, which is separate from the rest of the United States grid. But the deregulation and various forms of it have occurred across the United States. Different states have handled it differently. In Maryland, we're able to select different providers, with our utility bills. So there's various degrees of it. It just may be that they're more of the extreme case. And
the amount that those individual providers have to pay for kilowatt hour or per cubic foot of natural gas varies wildly, and there's concern too. I heard earlier today, particularly among some of the smaller providers, what had cost maybe $10 per cubic foot of natural gas is costing thousands of dollars now, and they're going to have to absorb those costs and likely are going to run out of money if they haven't already. So this is a ripple effect. It's when the sun comes back out, things warm up again, this doesn't go away. This is going to be a problem for Texas for a long time.
Well, actually, we've just been in the situation where we've had extremely low natural gas prices. After fracking and the boom in natural gas, the price dropped, and a lot of companies that produced natural gas basically went bankrupt because they couldn't sell it. They couldn't make any money for it. But then when demand goes up like it does right now, then the price goes up. And now there's less suppliers because a lot of the previous ones had closed up shop. So there's a problem inherent with absolutely pure capital free market in that there's no controls. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with free market, but it does mean that we don't have a regulation of these things, particularly in certain states like Texas. And so without those controls, there's much wilder price swings and therefore availability of natural gas than there might be in a more regulated state.
And I guess it's probably worth our sort of big picture look at this as well. And you make a really good point. Natural gas is plentiful now. The price is relatively good, and it makes it a very attractive fuel for for heating and cooling as well. But if, for example, there are natural gas pumping stations in Texas that decided they didn't need to insulate as well as they should, and some of those facilities have literally frozen shut now and can't work, you have to do this whole thing not with necessarily a complete eye to the bottom line. You also have to look like you're providing a necessary commodity here and continue to do it no matter what the situation is.
That's exactly right. So the United States used to have a very regulated energy supply, and it was deregulated in the 1980s, and more of this has happened since then. There's less incentive, financial incentive, to maintain some of the infrastructure, and that's really something that we need to address. Ultimately, the solution to this is distributed generation. It's getting away from centralized power, centralized gas pipelines, and going to a more, solar and batteries on your house as an example, which is what I have here.
Yeah.
So even when the grid goes out in Maryland, I still have electricity because I have solar with a battery backup. The more you distribute the generation, the less dependent you are on centralized sources and these types of occurrences.
One other thing I want to get into, and you sort of raised the issue there just a little bit, Governor Abbott in Texas, at least in one interview with Fox News, said, well, this is a prime example of why the new Green Deal doesn't work. He said, you can't use solar, you can't use wind because it's very expensive to store it, and that sort of flies in the face of the logic of if some of those wind turbines froze, they don't have that problem in Norway and other places because they use climate appropriate things. There are no easy answers here, are there?
Well, it's a complicated situation, but in fact, he was actually saying the exact opposite of what the situation
for
was.
Domestic consumption, yes.
Yeah, but so they have wind there, but that wasn't the issue. The issue was the natural gas pipelines froze. The more different distributed resources you have, the better. Climate is changing, weather is changing. It gets hot one season and cold the other, and the resources that we have geographically vary across the United States. Texas has a lot of fossil fuels, but it turns out that there's a central region there in the United States, like Texas, Oklahoma, which has a lot of wind, and they should harness it. We have wind in Maryland, we have solar. So the more different resources you have, the less dependent you are on one resource. And so actually, he let's say was mistaken, whether it's purely political or otherwise in his statement. And the more that he had other available resources, the better the situation would be, the more resilient his grid would have been, and the less that the people in Texas would be suffering today.
That was diplomatically put. Dr. Eric Wachsman, who's director of the Maryland Energy Innovation Institute at the University of Maryland, good enough to join us this afternoon and put some important perspective on what is a real mess down in Texas. Doctor, many thanks.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.